welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alastair Stephens. This week, the first part of our discussion of Charles Dickens' classic Great Expectations, with chapters 1 to 10, or I to X, if your copy has the same numbering convention as mine. Before we get to the actual reading, though, a word or two on how we read Great Expectations. I mentioned in the introductory episode of this series that this book is in many ways the culmination of Dickens' entire career. It doesn't push the envelope in any one particular way, but it is the best synthesis of all the various modes and genres in which Dickens has previously written. And if we're going to interpret the book in all of that complexity, we're going to need the right toolkit, the right sense of what the book is doing and why, and a certain grounding in its genres. And those genres aren't easy. Of all the many dubious and contradictory categorizations available to us as readers and lovers of literature, of all the shelves of setting or genre or intention, one of the most nebulous is gothic fiction. We know it when we see it, churchyards and crumbling stonework and mists on the moors, but it doesn't have a strong technical definition. Historically, it's a response to the intellectual emphasis of the Enlightenment period, a return to a more passionate, romantic, sensual, sexual, immediate kind of literature. The term Gothic fiction itself is derived from the settings of the foundational texts of the genre, which often featured Gothic architecture, that is to say, mid to late medieval northern French designs. This gives us directly one of the pillars of the genre, that the setting ought to be old, and it ought to intrude upon the present with a sense of the unknown depths of the past, of death, of morbidity, of things which have already fallen and will fall again. Gothic stories are often set in the past, as Great Expectations is, although they can also be contemporary and merely evoke the past. Horace Walpole, the author of the first novel described as a Gothic story, The Castle of Otranto, gives the other necessary pillar, that the world be somewhat fantastical, but the characters remain naturalistic. He saw this as a melding of the old style of pre-modern fantasy coupled with a pre-modern setting, and the new, modern 18th century style of naturalistic, grounded storytelling. So at the simplest level, Gothic stories are about the past casting a fantastical or supernatural shadow on the present. And while, much like its sister genre magical realism, there's nothing inherently frightening about Gothic literature, the interaction of normal people with a supernatural world almost always generates a feeling of fear, of insecurity, of our own significance in a world unknowable. This will be realized in its fullest measure, perhaps, by H.P. Lovecraft. It strikes me that Gothic fiction as a genre also relies upon a particular and painstaking unity within its world. Everything is turned to that same purpose. That same sensibility is present in every detail, varying only by degrees. Think of how everything in Wuthering Heights, for example, the characters, the landscape, the plot, the sky, everything gives that same sense of the dark, the unknowable. And of course, that thought goes back to the roots of the genre itself, to the work of Edgar Allan Poe. In his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, written in 1846, just 14 years before Great Expectation begins in All the Year Round, Poe argues for the importance of two things above all others: the unity of impression, by which he argues that a piece of art ought to be appreciated by the audience in a single, uninterrupted experience, arguing, of course, in the defense of the short story or the novella over the more expanded work, and the unity of effect, which demands that every element of the work strive to create the same sense within the reader. In other works, in other genres, we might appreciate variety. We might appreciate the combination of the tragic, the comic, the dramatic, the romantic. In Gothic fiction, however, everything is drawn together to serve one purpose. And while that isn't completely true of Great Expectations, because Great Expectations is other things besides a Gothic novel, it is worth considering how comprehensive the Gothic elements are in their pursuit of that single effect. We'll get a chance to talk about that as we reach Chapter 8 in this week's reading. And now that I think of it, the unity of impression too has a unique kind of applicability to Great Expectations because of its serialized format, and the fact that it's specifically designed to be enjoyed in smaller, bite-sized pieces. We aren't quite replicating that structure here in the podcast, and to point out the breaking points every time would be laborious, but I'll gloss this week's reading in terms of the original publication. Chapters 1 and 2 are released December 1st, 1860. Chapters 3 and 4 are released a week later. Chapter 5 is released on its own the following week because Chapter 5 is a larger chapter. 6 and 7 the week after, then 8 by itself, of course, and then 9 and 10 on January 5th, 1861. The novel as a whole is released over 36 weeks. 22 of those weeks will feature 2 chapters in the serialized excerpt. This leads to a certain inconsistency in the length of each serialized reading, running anywhere from 4,000 words to around 5,500. The first volume of the bound printed edition contained the first 19 chapters of the story. Volume 2 contained the next 20 chapters, carrying us up to chapter 40, and chapters 41 to 54 appear in the final volume of the bound edition. Though by that point, of course, we're certainly challenging Poe's unity of impression. So, let's set that aside and get back to the Gothic. If Great Expectations is, by weight, roughly 1/3 a Gothic novel, which might be generous, but I think is in the right wheelhouse, then what is the rest of the novel? Well, it's partly a mystery novel, it is partly a domestic drama, but it is in its largest part, I think, a Bildungsroman, a German loanword which means a novel of education or forming, what we would call more colloquially and less accurately a coming-of-age tale. Like Gothic literature, the Bildungsroman isn't very tightly defined. Some see it as an essentially modern form because of its preoccupation with youth and transformation and potential, which are in many ways cultural products of the last century. Others see it as a core narrative concept, one of the fundamentals, a recreation of one of the few shared experiences that we can all understand, that of growing up. Narratively, what makes the Bildungsroman unique as a genre is twofold. We begin with an event which will force the young protagonist off the tracks of what is socially conventional or expected or acceptable. Death, disease, tragedy, a personal flaw means that the protagonist is not like other children, that they are somehow on the fringes of society. Then, the arc of the novel both educates and integrates the protagonist back into society, making them a good example of their social group. From this, we can observe that the Bildungsroman is a pretty fundamentally conservative form. It seeks to reassert and confirm the expectations, there's that word again, that society has of the individual and celebrate a certain conformity, albeit a benevolent conformity. Thus, Pride and Prejudice can be seen in part as a Bildungsroman in which Elizabeth Bennet learns to set aside her pride and prejudice and become a good, productive, socially stable member of her community, specifically, in that instance, to become more like her sister Jane. Not every story of a young person growing up is going to fit this pattern. The notion of educating or of forming, the Bildung, is necessary. The Hobbit, for example, doesn't fit the pattern because Bilbo learns a more complicated lesson than merely being a good hobbit fitting neatly in the Shire. The Catcher in the Rye is an ambiguous example because it isn't clear at the end if Holden is going to get better and be integrated into his society, or if the modern malaise, the slow creeping toxicity of the mid-century period has already poisoned him. And I'll note here too that because society is never simply one thing, is never truly monolithic, we can absolutely argue about interpretations and about which social values are celebrated and which social values are condemned. Some might argue, therefore, that The Hobbit is in fact a part Bildungsroman from the perspective of the narrator, who values adventure and courage more than most hobbits. But I think you would have a fight on your hands to convince a purist. But literature, as we've said before, is not a puzzle with a fixed solution. Is Great Expectations, therefore, a Bildungsroman? Yes, though Pip, thanks to the voice of Dickens, isn't exactly a standard protagonist. And that kind of takes us back to the beginning, right? Because yes, Great Expectations is Gothic, and it's Bildungsroman, and it's a mystery, and it's a melodrama, and it's social commentary. It's also, in its worldview, the Victorian novel. A concept which we'll return to in more depth later in this series, but which we can encapsulate right now as a novel that seeks to bring together all of its disparate elements into a single coherent whole. The Victorian era is a period of progress toward final and complete understanding of the world around us, of the sciences, of the arts, of our own natures. Obviously, that didn't turn out to be true, but there's a real feeling in the latter half of the 19th century all across the Western world that we are on the brink of figuring it all out. And that's reflected in the art of the time, which seeks to be comprehensive, to be complete. That is most meaningfully contrasted with the modernist era of the early 20th century, which is defined by fragmentary narratives, by incomplete perspectives, by broken edges and sharp splinters, stories which do not cohere. So let's bear in mind as we move forward that Dickens is using these different elements of genre, which we'll see powerfully here in the first chapter of the book, of the Gothic and the Bildungsroman and of mystery fiction. He's using these things in pursuit of a greater coherent whole, which is where we will arrive at the end of the book. One thing to think about, though, and the other great genre with which Dickens is associated, is the role of satire in this book, particularly as it exists alongside the conservative genres of the Bildungsroman and the Gothic. Almost all horror fiction is to some degree conservative because we usually derive a narrative value from the punishment of social misbehavior. This is why the young couple who has sex in the slasher movie are the first to die. So we're combining all of that with the coming-of-age tale's affirmation of the standards and values of a good society. How does Pip fill that role? Well, let's get into the very beginning of the book and see what we can make of its famous opening lines as we consider the individual and the society, personhood and presentation. Quote, "My father's family name being Pirrip, and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip, and came to be called Pip." End quote. There's so much there. It's such an innocuous beginning that is nonetheless so rich. And let's note that Dickens takes a lot of criticism, mostly I will say from people who have not actually read Dickens. He takes a lot of criticism for being a serialized writer, for being paid by the word, and one way in which he absolutely excelled as a serialized writer is the hook. Word for word, line for line, he has some of the best openings in the business. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That clash of contrast and dissonance that begins A Tale of Two Cities, it's undeniable. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether the station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show, from David Copperfield, is magnificent and, of course, particularly apt in our reading of Great Expectations. Pip and David are similar in many ways, but their differences become enormously significant. Little Dorrit is not my favorite Dickens book, but the beginning, quote, "30 years ago, Marseille lay burning in the sun one day," end quote, is a masterpiece of balance and of intrigue. And of course, my beloved A Christmas Carol has arguably the best first page of any story in the English language. I will restrain myself, but consider, quote, "Marley was dead to begin with," end quote. And among these fine works, I think that Great Expectations has a special place. It's less showy than some, less complex than others, but it's the perfect illustration of much of what this book is doing. Let's begin with my father's family name. Not just the name of my father or my own surname, but the name of my father's family. We're connected immediately to history, to genealogy, to heredity, to our spot in the social hierarchy. Just as the other part of Pip's name, the Christian name, the baptismal name, the given name, asserts the importance of faith and social orthodoxy. Before we even get Pip's name, we're feeling both the pressure of this ordered society, of family, and of faith. And Pip, of course, cannot articulate these names that are given to him. He is insufficient to the demands of family and faith, and his insufficiency both takes on and is given a name of his own devising. "So I called myself Pip as a child with my infant tongue, and came to be called Pip in response by the people in his life. Because I couldn't do what was demanded of me by family, by faith." And we can consider, as we meet the convict and we meet Joe in the pages to come, the importance of articulation and expression. Because Pip couldn't be Philip, because Pip couldn't be Pirrip, he bears the diminutive name. He is, in a sense, less than what he ought to be. And this is a powerful beginning to any sense we might have of Great Expectations as a Bildungsroman. We'll note the remark about his parents' days being long before the days of photographs, the first successful example of which were produced around 1839 or 1840. So this roots us in the past of the Dickensian present. We know that Pip's parents died more than 20 years before the publication of the book, at least, but it turns out to be much further than that. Dickens is already looking backwards. He's anchoring Pip in the Gothic Dark Ages before the modern Victorian world. That difference in social sensibility will be important as we move forward, and will be much more important to the contemporary Victorian audience looking back at the end of the Regency period. I've mentioned how masterfully Dickens wields the written word, and I want to pause here in the third paragraph to observe a particularly masterful bit of writing. Quote, "Ours was the marsh country, down by the river, within as the river wound 20 miles of the sea." End quote. We can observe here, I think, two things. The winding, sinuous structure of the sentence mirrors the lazy curves of the river and mirrors the landscape itself. We begin in the marshes, then the winding of the river, then the sea. Also, per the linguist Geoffrey Leach and others, though it's through Leach that I learned of this feature of the English language, in English there is a particular value, an emphasis put on words which appear at the end of clauses and sentences. This is known as end weight. And it's an important part of our sense of cadence and significance, which is why I just said this is known as end weight and not end weight is what it is called. There is an emphasis to the way in which clauses and sentences conclude. And we see that here in the usual formulation, the marshes were our country, being reversed, which has the effect of emphasizing the marsh country, yes, and de-emphasizing the ours, which makes sense because Pip is isolated and largely alone, particularly in the context of the graveyard in which the rest of his immediate family have been buried. So ours is the marshland, and with a gothic flourish all at once, we're situating our small figure in this brooding, treacherous landscape. The literary camera pulls up and away from Pip and his de-emphasized community to the marshes, to the sinuous river, to the sea beyond. This, though, is balanced by the end of the paragraph and the incredible concluding sentence, more than 120 words long. This gives us the account of Pip's first experience of the place, of the world in general, and it brings our focus back down to the boy, once again situating the most important element at the end of the sentence. Quote, "At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dykes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and the small bundle of shivers, growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry, was Pip." End quote. So we repeat the same progress from the churchyard to the marshes, to the river, to the sea, but then all at once we're back with Pip. We're being resituated at the end of the sentence rather at the beginning, giving that end weight. He experiences all of these things and then finally experiences himself, coming all at once into self-awareness and being immediately challenged in that self-awareness, of course, by the emergence of the convict. Dickens is, in this way, engaging, I think, with our ideas about knowledge, with our notion of epistemology, perhaps more specifically, our notion of education. Obviously, Pip is learning about his parents, and siblings too, from their gravestones. It's the perfect entangling of the Gothic novel and the Bildungsroman, though Pip, without proper education, draws some errant conclusions, which the narrative voice, the older Pip, realizes. The Gothic flourish of the naming of these things in the world, in terms of their impact on this frightened young man, is enormously powerful. It anticipates, it heralds, we might even speculate narratively that it causes the appearance of this fearful criminal man. He is the manifestation of what the world, described in the previous passage, has done. The wilderness, we learn, is intersected with dikes and mounds and gates. This fearful man has been smothered by mud, lamed by stone, cut by flints. He is the product of the uncivil world that has been revealed to and has frightened Pip. But as we see between the chattering of the convict's teeth and the shivering of the boy, he is also like Pip. The dialogue here is sharp, and Dickens manages to communicate Pip's wide-eyed innocence in unexpectedly touching ways, I think, referring to his mother as also Georgiana and his father as late of this parish, echoing what is on the tombstone. It's particularly good. The convict's dialogue is complex, on the other hand, leaning into Dickens' skill with dialogue as a means of communicating character. He's rough, he's uneducated, he's lower class, and he's trying to be intimidating. We'll note the distinctive pronunciation habit of V's appearing as W's, as in Whittles, which he will later share with Joe. This doesn't seem to be terribly geographically specific, but does communicate a kind of thick-mouthed bluntness of speech. We should note, speaking of geography, that the landscape described in this part of the book situates the action in the county of Kent, on the southeastern tip of England, home to Dover and those famed White Cliffs. This is the part of England closest to France and the narrowest part of the English Channel, which accounts, of course, for the battery, the coastal fort indicated by the convict. As we noted in the introductory episode, Dickens spent a lot of time in Kent as a child, and though I'm sure that Pip's relationship with Mrs. Jo Gargery is worse than that of Charles Dickens and his mother, we should definitely remember the complexity of that relationship. The last symbol of the first chapter, though, honestly, we could have spent this entire session just talking about this first chapter and committed to an entire year of this book. The last prominent symbol is the convict in the gathering darkness, with the horizontal lines arrayed from sky to earth to river, and then the sailor's beacon and the gibbet, a means of navigation and a punishment for failing to navigate society properly. In Chapter 2, we see a rapid transition from the Gothic melodrama of the churchyard to a much more domestic, though perhaps no less grotesque, scene. Pip returns home only to be warned by Jo Gargery that Mrs. Jo is out looking for Pip for the 13th time, the baker's dozen, and favours physical chastisement of both Pip and her husband. We see throughout this chapter the cruelty of charity performed by those unsuited to it or those unwilling to do it. We'll get an echo of that, I think, in the description of Mrs. Jo buttering and slicing the bread, holding it close to her breast, her bib, though that too, the bib, is barbed with pins and needles and isn't the comforting safe haven a boy might expect from a mother figure. Holding with the left hand, buttering and then sawing with the right, even the provision of food for her husband and ward is an act of moderated violence. Pip conceals his bread and endures his medicinal punishment for eating too fast. Here we see that Joe's genuine care for Pip and his well-being, his, health, is just as difficult for Pip to endure as Mrs. Joe's much more callous treatment of him. Pip then lets his imagination run away with him, concluding, quote, "If ever anybody's hair stood on end with terror, mine must have done so then. But perhaps nobody's ever did." End quote. We should pause here to observe that Dickens possesses a real skill when it comes to illustrating the interiority of children. Pip's quavering resolution when faced with the world of unknowable darkness and few moral lighthouses, one stark, harsh, explicitly provided by Mrs. Jo, and the other softer, warmer, implicitly provided by her husband. Pip's interiority here is convincing, and it seems that for all that he's not the sharpest implement in the blacksmith's forge, he is good-hearted. We're continuing, too, here with the theme of education, as Pip wrestles with the moral quandary and learns from his sister, begrudgingly and harshly and with a skepticism of the value of education, quote, "Drat that boy," interposed my sister, frowning at me over her work. "What a questioner he is! Ask no questions and you'll be told no lies." It was not very polite to herself, I thought, to imply that I should be told lies by her, even if I did ask questions, but she never was polite, unless there was company. End quote. Pip is right, of course, but I think that Mrs. Jo's declaration is maybe a little more complex. "Ask me no questions and I'll tell you no lies," which is the standard British form of that idiom, comes from the 1773 comedy play She Stoops to Conquer by Oliver Goldsmith, one of the earliest examples of the resurgent genre of laughing comedy, that is, comedies which are actually funny rather than comedies which are sweet and sentimental. In the play, it's given as "Ask me no questions and I'll tell you no fibs," which is certainly a softer and less morally loaded version. The play is preoccupied with issues of identity and social class, and it's a strong reference point for Dickens, though it seems more likely that Mrs. Jo is presenting it as a proverb that has entered the language, rather than a direct quote from a piece of relatively high art. It's possible, as Pip supposes, that she's not interpreting the proverb correctly, that she's not reading the inference that she herself will lie. Certainly we're spending a lot of time here sketching the uneducated nature of the Gargerys, but it's also possible, given Mrs. Jo's more general response to Pip's questions, that she believes that curiosity, that education, are themselves dangerous and harmful things. When she finally relents and tells Pip about the prison hulk anchored just off the coast, she connects directly education and crime. Quote, "People are put in the hulks because they murder and because they rob and forge and do all sorts of bad, and they always begin by asking questions." We learn casually in this section that it is Christmas Eve, and we can perhaps take Dickens' lack of commentary on that to be itself somewhat satirical. After all, the Victorian era, and more specifically Dickens himself, had yet to elevate Christmas into the modern festival that it is today by the time that Pip is spending this somewhat cold and lonely Christmas Eve with the Gargerys. It would also speak, I think, to the contemporary Victorian reader of Pip's impoverishment, not just of money and of provision, of luxury, but of family and of joy and of love. It also contextualizes the events of the following day and the bringing of Pip's gifts to the convict at the Battery. Speaking of which, and having spent fully half of this podcast barely getting through the first 2 of our 10 chapters, let's pick up the pace a little bit. In Chapter 3, we return to the marshes with Pip now loaded with stolen food and the file from Joe's workshop, moving through the mist that is taking on the character of his own guilt. I particularly love the emergence from the mist of the black ox with the clerical white cravat gazing at Pip in his mute judgment. We get the detail that Pip had been to the Battery before with Joe and that he's going to be someday apprenticed to Joe as a blacksmith. Apprenticeship was the law of the land between the middle of the 16th century and 1811. During that period, the only way to enter one of the trades was to serve a minimum of 7 years as an apprentice, learning all you needed to learn and earning your mastery. So this, again, situates us back at the very dawn of the 19th century. We get the scene with Pip delivering the food and talking with the wretched convict, having first observed, by accident, the other convict, who Pip takes to be the young man that he was threatened with the previous day, and who the first convict obviously recognizes. The description of the convict eating is interesting, with Pip drawing the connection between the man and the hound, but going a step further than simply observing critically or even satirically a lack of manners and of good grace, instead inferring the reason why man and dog eat in the same gulping, hasty manner. Quote, "He swallowed, or rather snapped up every mouthful, too soon and too fast, and he looked sideways here and there while he ate, as if he thought there was danger in every direction, of somebody's coming to take the pie away. He was altogether too unsettled in his mind over it to appreciate it comfortably, I thought, or to have anybody to dine with him, without making a chop with his jaws at the visitor. In all of which particulars he was very like the dog." End quote. Cards on the table, dear listener, not all of the dialogue in this book is absolutely top tier. A lot of it is, but not all of it. But this scene is so beautifully balanced, so strangely warm and companionable, and by far the most Christmassy moment in Pip's day. The convict's account of his time in the marshes with a light head and a light stomach also neatly inverts Pip's experience the previous day, where the world was revealed to him and brought him knowledge. Here the world is obscured and brings not just the imagined unreal, but also shrouds the real firing of the cannon to announce the escape of the second convict. In Chapter 4, Pip returns home, and we get the secret sign of the crossed fingers between he and Joe, the indication that Mrs. Joe is in a cross mood. The reference here to the monumental crusaders refers to the crossed legs on statues from the 13th to 14th centuries, which were interpreted until very recently as indicating that the knight in question had died serving the faith. This has, and I mean by 2010, so really recently, this has been debunked. Pip and Joe, so much more like brothers than they are like foster father and son, eat their breakfast on the go while Pip observes the uncomfortable cleanliness of Mrs. Joe's home, a sterile formalism opposed to the more authentic Gothic tradition suffusing the rest of the book. We also see again how that formalism impedes any connection between Pip and his sister that might be considered maternal. Joe and Pip go to church. We note here that Joe is ill-suited to his clothes, whereas Pip is merely uncomfortable. And then we get the first real classic Dickensian moment with the arrival of the guests to Christmas dinner. Mr. Wopsle, the Hubbles, and Uncle Pumblechook, who is so well-to-do, we are told, from being a middleman in the trades of corn and seed, that he even has his own carriage. Pip also notes that this is the only time of the year when the front door is unlocked, which might, if you aren't British, indicate that the Gargery home is carefully secured at every opportunity, but it's actually a reference to the British convention of using the back door all the time, usually entering the house straight into the kitchen. The suspicion with which working class British people view those who put on airs or present themselves as being superior to their community is as powerful today as it was in Dickens' time, and as the late Terry Pratchett observed in his novel Weird Sisters, quote, "There were only 3 times in your life when it was proper to come through the front door, and you were carried every time." End quote. I'm going to note here too that there are shelves of university libraries dedicated to the interpretation of Dickens' many outrageous names. This is the author that gave the world Chuzzlewit and Swiveller and Pecksniff and Tappertit and Fezziwig, after all. But I am firmly of the opinion that at this point in his career, Dickens knows his reputation and is playing games with his audience. The names throughout the novel mostly defy, I think, definitive interpretation, though they all have that Dickensian euphony, that almost onomatopoeic ability to characterize those to whom they belong, as we see here with the introduction of the odious and self-congratulatory Bumblechook. "Mrs. Joe," said Uncle Bumblechook, a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man with a mouth like a fish, dull, staring eyes, and sandy hair standing upright on his head so that he looked as if he had just been all but choked and had that moment come to, "I have brought you all the compliments of the season. I have brought you, mum, a bottle of sherry wine, and I have brought you, mum, a bottle of port wine." End quote. The pompous Mr. Wopsle takes up the opportunity to deliver an impromptu sermon about pork, and I have to absolutely commend Dickens on having, quote, "You listen to this," said my sister to me in a severe parenthesis, end quote, being itself offset in parentheses. That is, chef kiss. After Pumblechook falls foul of the tar-water brandy that Pip left in the pantry to conceal what he had stolen, Mrs. Joe goes to retrieve the pie which was also taken, and Pip, overwhelmed by fear and guilt, flees from the house into the arms of soldiers bearing handcuffs. That, you'll note, is the end of Chapter 4. It is also, as I mentioned at the beginning of today's show, the end of the second installment of the novel as it was published in All the Year Round. It is quite the cliffhanger, which is, as cliffhangers are so often, immediately discarded when the story resumes in the next part. The shackles are broken, and the sergeant needs Joe to repair them. We don't need, I think, to dwell on the sergeant and Pumblechook drinking wine together, as scathing as it is. Instead, we can skip ahead to our return across the marshes, this time not cloaked in mist, but illuminated by the baleful red of the sunset, the gibbet and the beacon and the battery all visible. Then, all at once, we arrive at the convicts. Pip's convict, who has captured the other and is calling for the soldiers. We get the demonstration of the other convict's low character opposed with Pip's simple goodness. The second convict cannot look the first in the eye, while Pip does so steadily. The other man, the second convict, is dealt with, and Pip's convict claims that he himself stole from the blacksmith, exonerating Pip. That is the end of the somewhat action-packed fifth chapter, which was published all on its own. It is, of course, an important beat in what the book will eventually be, but I can't help but feel it is a little anticlimactic, or at least a little dramatic cul-de-sac at the moment. Though the recasting of the convict as a man of principle and even a man of a certain integrity is as deft a bit of writing as you're going to see, as well as a strong confirmation that Joe, too, is a good man. Quote, "So," said my convict, turning his eyes on Joe in a moody manner and without the least glance at me, "so you're the blacksmith, are you? Then I'm sorry to say I've eat your pie." "God knows you're welcome to it, so far as it was ever mine," returned Joe, with a saving remembrance of Mrs. Joe. "We don't know what you would have done, but we wouldn't have you starved to death for it, poor miserable fellow creature, would us, Pip?" End quote. This episode is concluded with a brief epilogue back home in which Pip asserts his love and loyalty to Joe, but can't quite be compelled to tell the truth and unburden himself for fear of what he will lose. Moving into Chapter 7, the book resolutely changes its focus, and as Pip begins to reflect on his educational status, Dickens sharpens his satire, depicting the evening school run by Mrs. Wopsle's great-aunt as a sham. And, of course, his own personal experiences working in the bootblacking factory and his mother's desire that he remain there informs his account of Pip's casual employment in the village and the collection of his meager income. Before we get to that specifically, I want to note the account that Pip gives right at the beginning of the chapter about his misinterpretation of the tombstone in the churchyard, and that he read Georgiana, wife of the above, not just as a reference to the physical placement of the names on the tombstone, but rather as a sign that his father was in heaven. This is in the same passage where he rather charmingly admits that he believed the catechism prevented him from walking the long way home. This Pip, you guys, he starts out such a good kid. But this also demonstrates the urgent need for education. So back to Pip, who receives assistance from Biddy and slowly learns the basics. Quote, "Much of my unassisted self, and more by the help of Biddy than of Mr. Wopsle's great-aunt, I struggled through the alphabet as if it had been a bramble bush, getting considerably worried and scratched by every letter. After that, I fell among those thieves, the 9 figures, who seemed every evening to do something new to disguise themselves and baffle recognition. But at last I began in a purblind, groping way to read, write, and cipher on the very smallest scale." End quote. Purblind here means half-blind or suffering from reduced vision, which is odd because the word enters English early in the 14th century, a contraction of pure blind, meaning entirely without sight. But the meaning of the word changes to the modern sense, or at least the Victorian sense, in less than a century. You'll note, too, the reference to the 9 figures, the digits 1 through 9. 0 is excluded here because it was considered at the time not a number, but rather a sign, having entered English mathematical usage only around the year 1600. Interestingly, the word zero is derived from the Italian translation of the Arabic word cipher, which also appears in this passage, though Pip here is using it in an archaic sense to mean arithmetic. A year has passed by the time that Pip writes his letter intended for Jo, which is, I think, an endearingly charming moment between the two of them. After the stress and the drama of the previous chapters, we're back in this warm and endearingly domestic mode, though it is scripted with the precision, the timing of a vaudeville comedy routine. Quote, "How do you spell Gargery, Jo?" I asked him with modern patronage. "I don't spell it at all," said Jo. "But suppose you did." "It can't be supposed," said Jo, "though I'm uncommon fond of reading too." End quote. The joke that Jo loves reading because it's an opportunity to sit by the fire and relax is lovely, and we get that cute back and forth as Pip repeats, "When you were as little as me." It's strong comedic writing, which is savagely undercut when Jo then tells Pip about his abusive father. We even get a little poetry from Jo, struck out in a single moment of creative inspiration. Quote, "What some are the failings on his part, remember, reader, he were that good in his heart." End quote. So the scene lays out Jo's difficult childhood, the abuse and the death of his father and of his mother, the loneliness that he felt thereafter, the wooing of Pip's sister, and the bringing of Pip into his house too. And we're contrasting this, of course, with the earlier account of Mr. Wopsle administering the exams to the students of the terrible evening school, which consists of quoting Shakespeare and William Collins' The Passions, an ode for music. Jo is not educated, but he is a good man, and he's atoning in his own way for the violence of his father toward his mother. And still, he's capable of kindness and, perhaps most importantly, of poetry, of art. Dickens comes down hard on the benefits of education, but he recognizes that ignorant and educated do not map cleanly to bad people and good. We'll note, too, because it will give us some perspective much later in the book, that Jo's decision to, well, if not atone by proxy for his father's violence, at least try to balance the scales somewhat, to consciously break the cycle of domestic violence by receiving his wife's wrath without contest, and even thinking well of her as he thinks well of his own father. This is not revenge. This is the opposite. So let's consider as we move forward that we've already been shown by the book's absolute moral heart, by Jo Gargery, that a man ought to be willing to bear the burden rather than perpetuate the violence that he himself suffered. Jo is quietly modeling a kind of masculine virtue, and I do hesitate to even gender this at this point. I think we'll see how it works opposite and contrasted with feminine virtue in the pages to come. Mrs. Jo and Pumblechook return from the market, bringing news that Pip is to be sent up to Miss Havisham. He is quickly bathed and changed and taken into the care of Pumblechook in advance of his meeting with Havisham the next day. After being drilled by Pumblechook on elementary arithmetic, Pip is deposited into the steely care of Estella at Satis House, a name with a great deal of meaning that we'll return to in the weeks to come. Quote, "This," said Mr. Pumblechook, "is Pip." "This is Pip, is it?" returned the young lady, who was very pretty and seemed very proud. "Come in, Pip." Mr. Pumblechook was coming in also when she stopped him with the gate. "Oh," she said, "did you wish to see Miss Havisham?" "If Miss Havisham wishes to see me," returned Mr. Pumblechook, discomfited. "Ah," said the girl, "but you see, she don't." End quote. It's a great introduction. I will note that I read Estella's "don't" at the end of that quote as a piece of patronizing condescension to a man obviously much less well educated than she is, for all that he is, aggressively middle class in the context of this small town. Estella displays an intelligence, a modernity throughout this first encounter that is like a breath of fresh air blowing through the book, for all that it's perhaps a little bracing in its chill. I find Estella to be such an immediately striking character, but we'll circle back around to her in a moment, because for now we're going to shift gears and we're going to do ultimately what we came here to do. Let's meet Miss Havisham in a secluded and shrouded dressing room lit with candles, sitting before her mirror, dressed in what is first presented as the finest luxury. But then, quote, "It was not in the first few moments that I saw all these things, though I saw more of them in the first moments than might be supposed. But I saw that everything within my view which ought to be white had been white long ago and had lost its luster and was faded and yellow. I saw that the bride within the bridal dress had withered like the dress and like the flowers, and had no brightness left but the brightness of her sunken eyes. I saw that the dress had been put upon the rounded figure of a young woman, and that the figure upon which it now hung loose had shrunk to skin and bone. Once I had been taken to see some ghastly waxwork at the fair, representing I know not what impossible personage lying in state. Once I had been taken to one of our old marsh churches to see a skeleton in the ashes of a rich dress that had been dug out of a vault under the church pavement. Now waxwork and skeleton seemed to have dark eyes that moved and looked at me. I should have cried out if I could. End quote. I mean, this is the pure, uncut stuff. This marks the sharpest possible turn back to the Gothic. I wonder, when reading this, what the contemporary response must have been to go from the terror of the convict and the marshes, the drama of the soldiery, the quiet, tragicomic domesticity of the Gargery house, to this. I mean, how could you possibly have expected what the rest of this novel was going to be? It's so tempting to zoom out here and talk fully about Miss Havisham, to talk about her as a whole, to talk about the various ways in which we might interpret her character, her story, her role in the novel, her presentation and image of herself. There are feminist lenses and political lenses. There are economic. There's the constant specter of class. There's Miss Havisham as a symbol of, or a stand-in for, or a reflection of Queen Victoria herself. There's so much to be done in that space, but for now, I want to focus on how she is revealed in the text itself. So we have the richness of her dress, the luxury of her surroundings, but crucially, we have the fact that it is incomplete. For she had but one shoe on, the other was on the table near her hand, her veil was but half arranged, her watch and chain were not put on, and some lace for her bosom lay with those trinkets, and with her handkerchief, and gloves, and some flowers, and a prayer book, all confusedly heaped about the looking-glass. As we'll see from the frozen clock, the frozen watch, progress toward her destination, the march of time, has been stalled, but time, of course, can't be stopped. And so the wear of the days and the months of the years has continued, nature consuming what artifice can't preserve. The white, symbolizing her virginity and purity, has faded to yellow. The dress was fit to the rounded figure of a young woman, full of life and vitality and fertility, but now the woman within has shrunk away. Faded, withered, sunken, shrunken, caught between a frozen moment and the inevitable progress of time. And it's interesting to consider the ways in which time, capital T, is present in this room in a way that it isn't in the more transitory scenes earlier in the book. Think of the red-washed sunset at which the soldiers go to the battery to retrieve the convicts, fading to the deep blues of twilight and night. Think of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, moments which are marked by their specificity and by their brief passage. As opposed to this place where Miss Havisham, as we learn, knows nothing of days of the week, nothing of weeks of the year, but here, where everything else is still and progress is forestalled, the weight of time itself is paradoxically felt. Let's consider that, particularly in the context of Dickens' choice to situate this part of the story during this pre-Victorian age, as we move forward. Havisham commands Pip to play, which he tries to do half-heartedly, and then arranges a very charged playdate between Pip and Estella, who play Beggar My Neighbor together. Again, Estella's acidity is striking and refreshing, though it does take on a different aspect under the watchful eye of Miss Havisham. Pip confesses that he finds Estella very proud, very pretty, and very insulting, and more importantly, her insults are changing the way that he thinks of himself, first of his hands, then of his boots, and worst of all, of Joe, who he blames for the rough and rude nature of his upbringing. Estella delights in treating Pip with contempt, even driving him to tears, though crucially Pip himself cannot articulate why, and then leaving him alone. Quote, "Within myself, I had sustained from my babyhood a perpetual conflict with injustice. I had known, from the time when I could speak, that my sister, in her capricious and violent coercion, was unjust to me. I had cherished a profound conviction that her bringing me up by hand gave her no right to bring me up by jerks. Through all my punishments, disgraces, fasts and vigils, and other penitential performances, I had nursed this assurance, and to my communing so much with it, in a solitary and unprotected way, I in great part refer the fact that I was morally timid and very sensitive." End quote. So because Pip has been faced with such injustice for his entire life, for disproportionate punishments and unkind judgments, this domestic antagonism, this refusal to offer maternal comfort, for these reasons Pip credits the fact that he is morally timid and very sensitive. Certainly, it is well documented, though not in Dickens' time, I'm sure, but it is well documented today that people who grow up in difficult home environments develop sensitivity to the emotional weather of the household as a survival mechanism. Knowing how to anticipate sudden scorn or criticism or judgment or, yes, even violence is sadly necessary. The moral timidity is interesting too. In the absence of justice, in the absence of reliable demonstrations of what is fair and good and virtuous, and furthermore in the absence of company, leaving Pip to commune so much with it in a solitary and unprotected way. Because of all of these things, Pip feels himself to be uncertain of what is good. So we can blame his sister for this. We ought to blame his sister for this. She occupies the role of mother, or should at least. But we can also blame Joe to some extent, because for all of his warmth and camaraderie with Pip, he models a submissive and irresolute character when dealing with questions of justice, when dealing with questions of what is good, a grander morality than his own personal perspective on his interactions with his wife. In a sense, this passage also frames for us, I think, the sequence at the end of the chapter when Pip, caught up in the atmosphere, the dread atmosphere of Satis House, sees the visions of Estella everywhere he looks, and then, of course, the vision of the dead Miss Havisham. Estella finds him and lets him out, and he walks the 4 miles back to the Gargery Forge, berating himself for his newly discovered inadequacies. And it's the blame of Mrs. Joe that presumably sparks his disobedience upon returning home and his demonstration of the insufficiency and ignorance, the credulity, the gullibility of both his sister and of Pumblechook as he refuses to answer their questions honestly. It's another reset of the tone, back somewhat to the comedic and the satirical, but it also demonstrates an edged change in Pip, a change of which he is aware, as we see after he confides in Joe that he made up the details of his trip to Havisham. Another small detail here that does so much to deepen these characters. As Joe is ruminating on Pip's deception and the path to uncommonness beginning always in the common, he references Pip's earlier story about playing with flags, wanting to believe in the fictionalized version of Pip's experience, even though he has just been told the truth. The parenthetical response to Pip's honest truth that there weren't, in fact, flags is so humble and simple that we can't help, I think, but feel connected to Joe, even as Pip feels less so. I'm sorry there weren't a flag, Pip. Upstairs, Pip reflects on his day, skipping past the incredible kindness and warmth and forgiveness shown him by Joe to Estella's presumed judgment of the blacksmith and his coarse quality. He falls asleep to memories of what he did at Satis House, quote, as though I had been there weeks or months instead of hours, end quote, which communicates both the impression that this experience has made on Pip and the strange weight of time in that shrouded room in that crumbling house. We conclude the chapter with this, quote, that was a memorable day for me, for it made great changes in me, but it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers that would never have bound you, but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day, end quote. So we'll note the obvious ambiguity here. Chains of gold or iron, like those worn by the conflicts, flowers or thorns. With which chain is Pip now bound? Which chain is being forged? And isn't a chain in the end still a chain, no matter what it's made of? In the broader sense, though, what we can see here is Pip's very normal, very human desire to narrativize his own life, to draw a line in the sand and insist upon its significance. This is, to be sure, a significant day. Even if it had no further consequence in his life, it would presumably rank among the weirder experiences he's ever had. But we're challenged here, I think, by the idea that this day was the first link in any chain. He went to Miss Havisham because Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook insisted upon it. We can track that chain back further still, even to Pip being taken in by his sister in the first place, back further to the death of his parents, and so on and so on. There is, functionally, no such thing as a new chain, no matter how much we might insist upon them. In Chapter 10, then, Pip resolves to improve himself by taking education from Biddy. Then in the pub, he meets with a mysterious figure who clearly knows something about him and is carrying Joe's old file, the one taken and given to the convict. After numerous questions, he passes Pip £2 notes, which Pip only discovers when they return home. These chapters, besides giving us an ominous respite from Havisham and from Satis House, serve two purposes, I think, to demonstrate Pip's increasing dissatisfaction with his standing in the world, or more than that, I guess, but actually with his own nature, and to build out the mystery of the convict. We would be forgiven for thinking that the storyline that started this book was now settled, but Dickens, bringing it back in mysterious circumstances, keeps it fresh in the memory. And of course, we end with Pip's reflection on his association with criminals seeming coarse and common, a disgraceful thing, and though he tries to comfort himself with the thoughts of Miss Havisham, he dreams of the stolen phial and wakes with a scream. A lot of setup. The beginning of Pip's more profound education and perhaps the slip into darkness. That'll do it for this week. Before we wrap up, though, I should mention that the poll has just dropped over on the Patreon page for our next series, which will begin in the first week of June. I wanted to give you guys a varied selection of science fiction novels to choose between, all on the theme of non-white visions of the future. And it was a task because there are dozens of really great candidates. So I had a hard time refining this list down to 4 options with a lot of variety between them. But this is a topic to which we will absolutely return in the future. Our first candidate is Binti by Nnedi Okorafor, which is actually a trilogy of novels plus a short story bound in a single volume in 2019. It follows the first member of the Himba people of Namibia to be accepted into a prestigious galactic university and her journey into space. Despite the 16-year-old heroine, it's not a YA series, though it is very accessible, and it's packed with some really interesting ideas about where we are going and where we are from. Secondly, a book by Cherokee writer Daniel H. Wilson called Robocalypse, a fragmented anthology of short stories and vignettes giving an accounting, almost an oral history, of humanity's fight against a hostile AI. Wilson is a roboticist by education, so the science is clean and eerily specific. So we get big sci-fi ideas and a very down-to-earth perspective on what it is that these characters are fighting to protect. Thirdly, Future Home of the Living God, a 2017 novel by Chippewa writer Louise Erdrich, in which evolution is behaving strangely. Evolution itself is regressing, and a pregnant young Ojibwe woman has to navigate identity and agency and self-determination, our collective place in the world. And of course, our last spot has to be taken by Octavia Butler, a legend in the field. I have selected for this poll Dawn, the first part of the Xenogenesis trilogy. Originally published in 1987, it follows a woman who wakes on an alien starship after being rescued from a nuclear apocalypse which destroyed the Earth. This book is focused on what being human means and how identity and biology and home interact. So that's our poll. Head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword, and cast your vote today. And then maybe stop by the Discord and tell me which other books you'd be interested in studying in this field. Speaking of the future, though, next week, chapters 11 to 22 of Great Expectations Inclusive, in which Pip takes responsibility for his own education, Mrs. Joe suffers an awful assault, and Pip leaves for London. I can't wait to talk about it. So until then, and as always, there, I know nothing of days of the week. I know nothing of weeks of the year. Come again after 6 days. You hear? Thanks for listening.